Awesome, thank you. Hi, everyone. As Tom introduced me, my name is Kira. A few things about me. I have been coming to Southridge since I was a baby. My parents have been coming to Southridge for 20 plus years, but I've also chosen to call Southridge home. You might see me serving in kids ministry on Sunday mornings or here in the audience Sunday mornings, and I spend most of my Thursday nights hanging out with our junior youth, which is super fun and super rewarding as well. I'm also a new teacher, just getting my foot in the door, and another thing about me that you might be able to relate to is that sometimes I am a deep thinker. I like to do my research. I like to think that I have a really solid understanding of things. And if you are anything like me, then big questions, uncertainties, and unknowns are really difficult to navigate. And today I'm going to share a little bit with you about how my questions and uncertainties actually are what brought me closer to God and helped deepen my understanding of who He is. So a few years ago, I was a young person navigating challenging questions about what it actually means to be a follower of Jesus and who Jesus actually is to me. When I was looking around, many people in my life seemed to have it all figured out. They seemed to confidently know all of the answers to what I thought are very difficult questions. I had different voices telling me who God is, each one having a slightly different perspective. Specifically, I had challenges figuring out what I believe about topics like love beyond belief or navigating tensions between science and religion. After a while, I became quite conflicted, confused, and very angry with some people and frustrated with God as well. But now I can see that my experience is actually quite common. It's common to question, to feel uncertain, and to feel confused when it comes to trying to uncover who God is and who we are from all of the cultural and political noise that surrounds us today. And I think this is true sometimes, especially for young people who are faced with the challenge of making sense of our faith in a world that seems to be becoming increasingly complex. So not only is this a shared experience, maybe one that some of you might be able to relate to, but for me, this experience was essential for the development of my own faith and for the new understanding that I have about God. I feel that I wouldn't have this understanding about God that I'm going to share with you had I not experienced this season of uncertainty and questioning. It was through my uncertainty that I feel that I now have just a little bit more of an understanding of who God is and how He sees us. I'm going to start off by quoting the philosopher and bishop St. Augustine, who in about 400 AD wrote that you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. My restless heart has found its rest in God, but only after bringing my uncertainties to Him. I relate to this quote in my experience of uncovering who God is. So one of the key learnings that helped me tremendously in my faith that I'm going to be sharing about today is that God wants us to wrestle with Him. He wants us to press into Him when we are angry, confused, or conflicted. He wants us to be honest about whatever questions, doubts, or complaints that we might have. Today, I brought with me a copy of Gregory A. Boyd's The Benefit of the Doubt. And this was a super helpful resource for me. And I'll be referencing a chapter in this book titled Wrestling with God that was particularly meaningful. So in this chapter, Wrestling with God, the author, Boyd, discusses a story about Jacob from Genesis in the Old Testament. Jacob is the grandson of Abraham and is known for cheating his brother Esau out of his father's blessing. So that's what he's known for. But he's also particularly significant because his 12 sons become the 12 fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. So making Jacob the direct ancestor of the Israelites. So the story that Boyd refers to is from a short section of Genesis 32, which perhaps raises a lot more questions than it actually answers. But it starts in verse 22. And Jacob finds himself wrestling with a man during the night. If we look at the text in Genesis, it says that the man sees that he could not overpower Jacob. So he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Now, it may be intentional that the story itself gives the reader something to wrestle with. You might be asking, how is the man able to dislodge Jacob's hip with just one touch? And yet, it also says that the man was unable to overpower Jacob. So, simultaneously, the man was unable to overpower Jacob and was able to dislodge his hip with just one touch. And then later in the text, Jacob's wrestling partner reveals to him that he is God. So another question is raised. Why does the text say that the man is unable to overpower Jacob if he's God? One interpretation of this story is that it's being told from Jacob's perspective. Of course, God would be able to overpower Jacob anytime he wanted, if that's what he wanted to do. But God appearing to Jacob as a regular man suggests that the Lord wanted to appear to Jacob as a wrestling opponent that he could conceivably defeat. The Lord wanted Jacob to think that he might have a chance in overpowering him. Now, in this book, the author, Boyd, compares the relationship between Jacob and the Lord to his own relationship with his 5-year-old grandson. Now, they engage in regular wrestling matches where he pretends to be defeated by his young grandson, even though Boyd would obviously win against his 5-year-old grandson if he really tried to. But it was through those long, hard hugs when they were wrestling that Boyd and his grandson gradually wrestled their way into a deeper relationship. Because Boyd's grandson thinks he has a chance at defeating his grandfather, he continues to press in, pressing into his grandfather and deepening their relationship as well. Now, when I read about this comparison, I immediately thought of my dad wrestling with our old dog. Although he might disagree, I'm sure my dad enjoyed spending time with the dog in this way. And I'm sure their relationship also grew during these matches. The only difference is that I'm not so confident my dad would win against the dog every time. Now, this story from Genesis about Jacob wrestling with God, if we look at it, it becomes increasingly more complex as we read. Jacob and God wrestle through the night, and at daybreak, the Lord asks Jacob to let go of him. Now, why does God need to leave in the morning? We don't really know. But I think the next part is where we need to be paying closer attention to. Jacob replies, "I will not let you go until you bless me." And then the Lord asks Jacob, "What is your name?" And Jacob replies, "Jacob." The Lord then says in verse 28, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." So here, Jacob has been rewarded because he has struggled with God and has overcome, as the Lord says. The story indicates that this name change is the blessing that Jacob has been wrestling for. This name change or this blessing is not actually because Jacob has overpowered God in any way. Jacob had not overcome the Lord by being physically stronger or by wrestling with more force. But instead, according to God, Jacob had overcome or succeeded because he had the boldness to wrestle with God and not let him go until he received his blessing. Now, another note here, the naming of Jacob here is significant, as the Lord is revealing to us that Jacob and his descendants, the Israelites, would have the distinctive characteristic of being willing to struggle with God and with others. So part of the identity of God's chosen people is that they would have the boldness to wrestle with God. So here we've learned about Jacob, and his willingness to wrestle with God is actually what pleases him. Job is another well-known example of an individual who's willing to wrestle with God. Now, Job is not a descendant of Jacob. However, his willingness to bring his questions and complaints authentically and sincerely to God is ultimately what pleases the Lord in the end. So in the book of Job, if you're unfamiliar, Job is unknowingly caught in the middle of spiritual warfare, leading to a lot of suffering. We see Job taking a very honest and open stance in the conversations that he has with God. So in Job chapter 32, Job says, "But I desire to speak with the Almighty and to argue my case with God." Now, what Job says here stuck out to me because this is how I felt in my own season of uncertainty. Job insists on making his case and arguing with God. Job is not sitting back and watching his suffering happen to him. He's taking a position on what is happening to him and seeking to take it up with the one and only God. So Job has the boldness to bring God his complaints. Throughout the book of Job, we see that Job's complaints actually become more and more harsh towards God. Job develops the mistaken view that God is the cause of his suffering. So, for example, in chapter 30, verse 21 to 22, he says to the Lord, "You turn on me ruthlessly. With the might of your hand you attack me. You snatch me up and drive me before the wind. You toss me about in the storm." So here Job takes on the view that God is the direct cause of his suffering. Now, we know that Job is incorrect. If we read the book of Job, we know that he's incorrect. God is not responsible for his suffering. However, in chapter 42, God says that actually Job is right. But God is not talking about the way that Job identifies God as the cause of his suffering. God says Job is right because Job is speaking honestly and sincerely. God is pleased with the way that Job has brought his authentic complaints to him. Now, before I move on, I also want to talk about Jesus a little bit. Jacob and Job are both two imperfect people from the Old Testament who bring their full selves authentically before God. But Jesus, the one who demonstrated perfect faith, also stood before God authentically. As Jesus is on the cross, experiencing separation from the Father as he bore the sin of the world, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, I am no theologian, so maybe we can talk about the nuances of what this actually means and what this looks like theologically another day. But Jesus on the cross had been God's plan from the very beginning. But Jesus, in his bewilderment and in his immeasurable pain, suffering, and loneliness, actually questions God, asking why. Jesus in this moment takes on our sin and shame, freeing us forever. but he also shows us what perfect faith looks like, which is first and foremost authentic. So, Jacob wrestling with God and Job voicing his complaints to God, and Jesus questioning God even when this had been the plan all along, all show us that faith is grounded in authenticity, that is unwilling to conceal our questions, doubts, or complaints. So, why was this learning so important for me? There's two main reasons for me. First, I was extremely relieved. I felt seen and I felt understood. I had comfort knowing that faith is actually not about understanding everything and trusting God in the midst of it. I had permission to ask questions if I was unsure about something. And I had permission to say, you know what, I don't know the answer to some of the really big questions that I had. And second, I learned that this is actually the point of following Jesus and living a life of faith. Where we are weak, he is strong. Where we have blind spots, he sees all. God does not ask us to come to him when we get it all figured out and when we have the right answers, but rather, he asks us to come to him right now, just as we are. The author of this book, Boyd, I'm going to quote him once again, but he writes that until a relationship is real, it can never truly be transforming. When I began to exercise an authentic faith is when I began to understand God's truly loving nature and experience more fully the loving union that God has with me. So my hope is that this can be an encouragement for you if you are or if you have ever been in a season of uncertainty when it comes to your own faith. Your difficult questions are actually not too much for God to handle. And in fact, your difficult questions might be what helps you experience more fully the loving character of God. So moving forwards, I hope that we can all practice bringing our full and honest selves to God. Thank you very much.